We turn now to the songs by George Harrison and the one song by Ringo Starr on this album, the White Album from 1968. We'll also talk a little bit about the other song released in 1968 by George that's not on the album, and that is The Inner Light. So the first of these songs, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, we'll spend some time on that in the close-up that follows right after this. We'll just point to this one as being one that features Eric Clapton and is maybe in many ways thought of as one of the kind of more mature songs by George Harrison that we've seen up to this point. In many ways, I see it as a pretty good prefiguration of what his solo career is going to be. Albums like All Things Must Pass are pretty much in the mold of what he's doing with While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Piggies is another one that I've chosen to talk about in the song Close Up because I find some parts of it are fascinating in terms of the overall context that we're drawing around these records. It's a social commentary that sort of makes fun of square conformists, and I'll save the rest of my ammunition on that one for the song Close Up. Long, Long, Long is a kind of another George prayer. There are a lot of these George prayer songs. Usually they're the Indian-influenced ones with Indian instruments. It's another George prayer tune, but in this case, Long, Long, Long is a song that uses traditional sort of pop music instrumentation, so you don't get the sitars or the and the Indian instruments or percussion, that kind of thing. It's really set up more like a kind of acoustic rock kind of tune, and so we're beginning to see with Long, 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 George's sort of he's not so much feeling the need to put the Indian element of his musical influence like directly on the surface where everybody can see it. It's starting to work its way more into the fabric of his music, and you can see him coming back more to traditional, or to more conventional pop styles with Long, Long, Long. So kind of a sleeper song on the record, but one that indicates a kind of transformation in George's songwriting, I think. Savoy Truffle is a fun one. It's inspired by Eric Clapton's passion for chocolates despite having cavities. So, you know, the guy liked the chocolates, but when he would eat them, it really hurt until he got the dental work done that he needed to get done. And so this was all about George kind of making fun of it. He actually reads from the inside lid of a chocolate box, and while being a little less serious than John Lennon reading from a newspaper or from a circus poster, you can definitely see the parallel there. Here's George turning to a technique, and we'll talk about this in the close-up, turning to a technique that had been very much a part of the John Lennon sort of songbook up to this point. And so we see George just a step or two behind the other two Beatles, even in his maturity, picking up on a lot of the things that they're doing as well and making his own contribution. And then, as I said, we'll talk about in a minute The Inner Light, which was recorded in January of '68, and the B-side to Lady Madonna, released in the spring of '68. Let's talk just for a minute about the Ringo song. In the case of this one, a song called Don't Pass Me By. Now there will be another Ringo song, not counting Flying, where he's attributed to, he gets authorship because all four of them get authorship for that one on Magical Mystery Tour. The other Ringo song is Octopus's Garden, which makes its appearance on Abbey Road. So Don't Pass Me By, one of the few Ringo songs we have in the Beatles, and that's because, according to Ringo, and he likes to tell the story, he tells it almost the same way every time, that he would often come in having written a song, and he would say to the guys, I've written a song. And so he would play the song for them, and it would turn out that he had rewritten a song that already existed. In other words, he didn't know it, but he was actually singing the melody and playing the chords to a song that everybody knew. He just changed the lyrics, and he was somehow convinced that he'd written a new song. He didn't realize what it originally was. And so it got to be kind of a gag. Every time he would come in with a song, it'd be like Spot the Tune. So Ringo would come in and he would play the song, and they would all say, I know what it is, and they would say what it was, and they would go to the piano and demonstrate, and then they would all laugh like crazy at poor Ringo because he'd once again rewritten somebody else's song. Of course, you can't record somebody else's song as your own. It's plagiarism. You got to record it as theirs or give them credit or something. So Don't Pass Me By was one of those songs that passed through that filter. It actually wasn't a song written by somebody else, and so they recorded it and gave it to Ringo on this record. Well, let's just summarize the White Album right now, and then we'll go on to the George Harrison song close-ups in the next video. But let me just sort of bring everything back together a little bit, having now talked about Paul and John and George and that one Ringo song, and just remind you that the White Album really presents three separate songwriters, all more or less operating in singer-songwriter mode. So I've talked about them as a kind of songwriters co-op in which they're using the Beatles as a vehicle for the songs of mostly the three songwriters in the group. Now, George doesn't get as many songs as John and Paul do, but still he gets 4, which is more than he would have gotten really on any other single album that they might have done. Still, he had a bunch of material left over, and the All Things Must Pass album isn't a triple album for no reason. He had a lot of sort of back catalog waiting around to come out that he couldn't get on the records because you had Lennon and McCartney. So I think in many ways, these three songwriters working together under the title of the Beatles is really a pretty faithful precursor of what each of their solo careers is going to become. I think if you were going to trace the John Lennon solo career, you'd want to go back into the White Album and see what kinds of things he was doing here. And much of what you're seeing here, you're going to see play out in his solo career. The same thing goes for Paul. The same thing goes for George. Now, this is going to continue as we talk about the Get Back / Let It Be album and Abbey Road. We're going to see that. I mean, it's not like it stops and then picks up again with their solo careers. But here's really where you start to see that after the Sgt. Pepper Magical Mystery Tour, they really start to be, two primary songwriters and George Harrison, just kind of using the band as a vehicle to get these songs out and get them to people. So let's, in the next video, take a look at 3 George Harrison songs, and in the last video we'll talk a bit about Yellow Submarine, also released in 1968. So now let's turn to consideration of The Inner Light, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and Piggies.